Welcome to the Explainer. If you've ever been sitting in a meeting and caught yourself pausing for just a second when someone asks if a new feature is verified or validated, well, you're definitely not alone. These two terms get thrown around interchangeably all the time, don't they? So today, we're going to break down these two critical concepts. We're going to look at exactly what makes them fundamentally different and why getting both of them right is absolutely crucial to your success in software testing.
Here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with the ultimate goal of testing, dive into the verification question, then tackle the validation question. After that, we'll look at static versus dynamic processes, and finally, bring it all together.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, the goal of testing. And spoiler alert, it's about way more than just finding bugs.
Before we start splitting hairs over specific vocabulary, we kind of have to step back and ask a much broader question. What exactly is software testing? Honestly, if you asked 10 different developers or PMs, you'd probably get 10 completely different answers, right? Like, is it just running some code to see if the whole thing crashes? Is it trying to actively break the app? Or maybe just a final checklist before you hit launch?
Well, the core goals actually fall into three distinct buckets. Yes, the first one is exactly what comes to mind for most folks, identifying defects and critical bugs so things work as intended. But look closely at those other two. Testing is also fundamentally about proactively preventing those defects from happening in the first place, to push up overall quality. And, maybe the biggest deal for your stakeholders, it's about confirming the software actually delivers expected business value. It's a really proactive, holistic process.
Now, to actually pull off those massive, overarching goals, we have to filter that broad definition down into actionable steps. The entire testing discipline rests heavily on two main pillars: verification and validation. Because these words sound so incredibly similar, it makes total sense why they get mixed up. But in the software engineering world, this is a huge paradigm shift. They mean fundamentally different things and serve completely different purposes.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. The verification question, or checking the specs.
So verification is the process of ensuring the product is built according to the requirements and design specifications. Think of it strictly as checking the blueprint. At this stage, we are not asking if the blueprint is actually good or if the architecture even makes sense for the neighborhood. We're just asking, did the builders follow the blueprint they were handed, right down to the letter? Does this software meet the precise design specs laid out at the very beginning of the sprint?
If you only take away one thing about verification from this entire explainer, I want you to make it this exact question. Are we building the product right? Take a second and just let that phrasing really sink in. Are we building the product right? As in, are we doing the math correctly? Are we following the precise architecture the design team handed down? Is the code structurally sound based on our internal standards?
In the real world, verification looks exactly like reviewing documents and inspecting code. It's a lot of meetings, detailed walkthroughs, and peer reviews. You're combing through the source code line by line or reading over strict requirement docs. To use a cooking analogy, it's exactly like reading a recipe over and over to make absolutely sure you measured the flour and sugar perfectly long before you even think about turning the oven on.
Right, let's transition to Section 3, the validation question. This is all about meeting user needs.
Here, the focus shifts entirely to the actual human being using this product. Validation means ensuring the product meets the actual needs of the user or customer. Notice the stark contrast with verification there? We're not talking about technical requirements or internal specs anymore. We are talking about external value. We're testing whether the software actually solves the customer's real-world problem.
Now, what's really interesting here is the subtle but totally critical shift in the word order. Validation asks, are we building the right product? Not building it right, but building the right product. Think about it like this. You could perfectly follow a blueprint for a massive suspension bridge, verifying every single cable, every rivet. But if that bridge leads to a totally empty island that literally nobody wants to visit, it completely fails validation. The customer didn't actually need a bridge there.
The absolute best, most practical example of validation is testing the application with real-world scenarios. We're putting the software in front of actual users or simulating their exact daily workflows. Going back to our baking analogy, if verification is rigorously checking the recipe ingredients, validation is actually taking a bite of the fully baked cake to see if it tastes any good. I mean, it doesn't matter if you followed the recipe flawlessly if the end result is something the customer refuses to eat.
Which brings us to Section 4, static versus dynamic processes, the battle of action versus inaction.
So, the crucial point here is understanding the physical state of the software during these different tests. Verification is fundamentally a static process. There is absolutely zero code execution happening. You're reading, you're inspecting, you're reviewing text and logic. Validation, on the other hand, is a dynamic process. It absolutely involves running the code. You physically have to launch the application, boot up the environment, and interact with the software to see if it meets the user's needs. It's the literal difference between inaction and action.
And this brilliantly illustrates how they stack up against each other. Verification asks, are we building the product right, using static, non-executing processes? Validation flips the script, asking, are we building the right product by dynamically running the code? It puts these two concepts into a highly logical, easy-to-remember framework.
Let's picture this in your day-to-day workflow side by side. Verification means you're sitting at your desk, reviewing requirement docs, checking specifications, and doing static code inspections. Validation means you are spinning up the application, testing real-world scenarios, actively clicking buttons, and running through end-to-end user journeys.
Finally, Section 5, bringing it all together with the dual approach. At the end of the day, software testing requires both verification and validation. You simply cannot have one without the other if your ultimate goal is actual business value and high quality. Static verification makes sure your code is structurally sound and safely follows the initial design. Meanwhile, the dynamic validation tests guarantee that this structurally sound code actually solves the problem you set out to solve for the end user. When you combine them, you prevent defects and deliver a product that customers will absolutely love.
I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. Are you just checking the code, or are you actually solving the user's problem? The next time you're reviewing a new feature or sitting in a sprint planning meeting, take a step back and ask yourself, are we verifying or are we validating? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.